If you were tasked with designing a universal language from scratch, you might logically start with something like mathematics or, music.
Right. Yeah, something universal.
Exactly. You'd want a system that completely transcends national borders, ignores linguistic barriers, and is just instantly understood by virtually anyone on Earth.
Mm.
But it turns out humanity already built an open source language. We've been speaking it fluently for centuries, and you don't need a textbook or a translation app to understand it. You literally only need a round object.
It's a remarkable piece of social engineering, really. I mean, the barrier to entry is essentially zero, which is why it scales unlike anything else in human culture.
Welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to shortcut you directly to becoming a well-informed aficionado of the beautiful game association football, or, depending on your geographic location, soccer.
Great naming debate.
Right. And we are going to unpack how the really simple innate act of kicking a ball evolved into a 19.6 billion euro industry, and that's just for its top 5 European leagues, and an event watched by like 60% of the global population.
It's wild. Today, an estimated 250 million people play it actively across over 200 countries and territories.
Those numbers are just staggering.
They are, but, the sheer scale is really just a symptom of a much deeper psychological mechanism. We aren't just looking at an athletic competition here. We're looking at a mirror that reflects economic structures, historical conflicts, and honestly, our most deeply ingrained tribal instincts.
So to understand how we arrived at this era of multi-million-dollar mega stadiums, we need to strip away all that modern infrastructure entirely.
Right, take it back to the beginning.
Exactly. Before the massive television rights and the perfectly standardized pitches, there was simply a human instinct to kick something. And this wasn't a localized phenomenon at all. Kicking games emerged independently across multiple, completely disconnected ancient civilizations.
Yeah, the independent invention of these games tells us a lot about human motor skills and just how we play. Like, in Han Dynasty China, so spanning roughly 206 BCE to 220 CE, there was a military training exercise that eventually evolved into a highly competitive game.
Okay.
It was called Kuju, which literally translates to kickball.
Oh, kickball. So pretty self-explanatory.
Very. But it was incredibly physically demanding. Players had to pass a ball. Eventually, they started using an innovative inflatable animal bladder covered in leather during the Tang Dynasty without letting it touch the ground.
Wait, so like keepy uppies?
Basically, yeah. But the objective was to kick it through a small circular opening positioned on top of bamboo poles.
Oh, wow.
And those poles were 10 to 11 meters in the air.
Are you serious? I mean, think about the core strength and the agility required to elevate a ball 30 plus feet into the air without using your hands at all.
Right, it's intense, and this instinct spread. Thanks to the Silk Road trade routes, Kuju heavily influenced games like Kamari in Japan.
But we also see completely separate iterations elsewhere,
Right.
right?
Oh, absolutely. In ancient Greece, there was Episkuros.
And fun fact for our listeners, the modern UEFA European Championship trophy actually features an engraving of an Episkuros player. It's from a stone relief carved around 375 BCE.
That's a great detail. And meanwhile, in North America, the Algonquian people played a mass game called Pasuka Hohawag.
But that's the one played on the beaches, right?
Yeah, it involved hundreds of players on miles-long stretches of beach, just massive, sprawling games.
Okay, but let me jump in with a bit of pushback here.
Here?
If the instinct to play these chaotic, ball-kicking games was this global phenomenon popping up everywhere from the beaches of North America to military camps in China, why do we constantly credit a bunch of 19th century guys in an English tavern for inventing it?
Right. Well, what's fascinating here is that distinction. That's where the history of modern sports actually begins. We have to separate the physical act of playing from the concept of codification.
Codification, so the rules.
Exactly. The English did not invent kicking a ball. What they invented was the bureaucratic framework. Prior to the mid-19th century, every village, every public school, and every university in England played by entirely different local customs.
So if a team from Eton played a team from rugby.
They literally couldn't agree on how to play. The invention we are talking about is the standardization of rules that allowed rival groups to compete without the match descending into a literal street brawl.
Which brings us to a really fascinating linguistic detour regarding the name of the sport itself.
Oh, the soccer versus football debate.
Yes. For our listeners in the United States, Australia, and parts of Ireland who use the word soccer, You are not relying on some American invention to describe the game. You're actually speaking 19th century British slang.
The etymology is incredibly specific here. In the 1870s at Oxford University, it was just highly fashionable to add the suffix "er" to the end of words.
Right, so they took the word association from association football, abbreviated it to a soccer, and eventually whittled it down to just soccer.
Yeah, and they did the exact same thing with rugby football, calling it rugger.
So this endless global debate over whether the sport should be called football or soccer is, at its core, just an argument over a Victorian college nickname.
It really is. But that word association is the linchpin of this entire history. The formation of that specific association is basically the fulcrum on which modern sporting history balances.
Let's set the scene for that, because honestly, reading the sources, this plays out exactly like a messy Silicon Valley startup split.
Oh, 100%.
So it's the morning of October 26, 1863. Representatives from 11 different clubs gather at the Freemasons Tavern in London.
Mm-hmm.
Their goal is to ratify the original 13 laws of the game. They're trying to build a unified product. But very quickly, it becomes apparent that these co-founders have completely incompatible visions for what this game should be.
Yeah, and the ideological schism centered around a practice called hacking.
Hacking.
Yeah, hacking, in the context of 19th century football, literally meant kicking your opponents in the shins to bring them down.
It's just brutal. So the newly formed Football Association, spearheaded by a guy named Ebenezer Cobb Morley, they wanted to outlaw both hacking and the practice of running with the ball in your hands.
Right.
Morley envisioned this game of finesse, spatial awareness, dribbling. He wanted a really sleek, foot-based product.
Conversely, though, the representative from Blackheath FC fiercely defended hacking.
Of course they did.
Well, you have to understand the Victorian mindset at certain public schools. They equated physical endurance and, take a kick to the shin with the cultivation of manliness and moral courage.
So banning it would soften the players in their eyes.
Exactly. So Blackheath refused to compromise. They withdrew their club from the Football Association, and they basically took their specific intellectual property with them.
And that faction eventually formed the Rugby Football Union.
Yes.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. It's like two co-founders realizing they have totally different visions. One group pivots to a highly technical foot-based game, and the other group takes the full contact ball carrying mechanics to create a combat sport.
That's a perfect analogy because by entirely removing the hands from the equation, the Football Association forced an artificial limitation that created a whole new tactical universe.
Right, because suddenly your feet have to do everything.
Exactly. When you can't use your most dexterous limbs to manipulate an object, the level of physical intelligence required to control a ball while running at full speed just shifts dramatically.
Yeah.
Those foundational parameters created at the Freemasons Tavern are the DNA of the sport, and they're safeguarded to this day by the International Football Association Board, or IFAB.
Okay, so while the men's game was busy codifying these rules and building this massive organizational empire, the women's game was on an equally passionate, yet vastly more turbulent trajectory.
Oh, definitely.
And it was a trajectory that was actively suppressed by the very institutions that had just finished writing the rule book.
Yeah, the historical record for women playing the sport stretches back almost as far as the men's. I mean, we see women depicted playing Cuju in those Han Dynasty frescoes.
Whoa.
Yeah. And there are documented accounts of annual women's matches occurring in Scotland way back in the 1790s.
That's incredible.
But the organized modern movement gained serious traction around 1894 when an activist named Nettie Honeyball founded the British Ladies Football Club.
And Honeyball's mission wasn't just recreational, right? She explicitly positioned women's football as a pillar of the broader emancipation movement.
Exactly. It was a highly visible way for women to assert physical agency and claim space in the public sphere.
And that movement hit an unprecedented acceleration point during the First World War.
It did. The societal dynamics of WWI completely upended traditional gender roles. With a vast portion of the male population deployed to the front lines, women entered the heavy industries and munitions factories en masse.
Right.
And to maintain morale and also to raise funds for war charities, these female factory workers formed their own football teams.
The most prominent of these was the Dick Kerr Ladies FC in England.
Yeah.
And their success is just difficult to overstate.
It's mind-blowing.
On Boxing Day in 1920, they played a match at Goodison Park in Liverpool that drew a verified crowd of 53,000 spectators. And there were thousands more turned away at the gates.
Yeah.
We're talking about 53,000 paying fans watching a women's match in 1920. How does a sport that draws 53,000 screaming fans just get essentially erased from mainstream culture by a boardroom decree?
Well, they were an absolute cultural phenomenon, but that staggering success triggered a swift and calculated institutional backlash. In 1921, the Football Association passed a resolution that banned women from playing on any pitches affiliated with the FA.
Just ban them completely.
Yeah. The boardroom decree justified this by stating the game of football was, and I quote, quite unsuitable for females and ought not to be encouraged.
Which is wild. But this wasn't actually about medical science or protecting women's health, was it?
Not at all. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it was about a perceived threat to masculinity and financial control.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
So, the post-war climate had a strong societal push to force women back into traditional domestic roles to accommodate returning soldiers. But crucially, this was an economic and psychological panic.
Right. The men running the FA were threatened.
Deeply unsettled by the massive crowds the women were pulling, especially while the men's professional leagues were struggling to rebuild their own audiences after the war.
Ah, so it was about the money.
Always. The FA had no financial control over the lucrative charity matches the women were organizing, so they simply utilized their monopoly on the physical stadiums to choke the women's game out of existence.
And this institutional suppression wasn't even confined to Britain. This anxiety over women playing a male-dominated sport triggered bans globally.
Yeah, it was a domino effect.
Brazil outlawed women's football by legal decree from 1941 all the way until 1979. It was banned in France. West Germany maintained a ban until 1970. We are looking at a deliberate erasure of half a century of development.
Which is tragic. That translates to 50 years of lost infrastructure, 50 years of denied funding, and multiple generations of athletic talent that just never received formal coaching or platforms.
Yet the sport survived. The English ban was finally lifted in 1971. In 1991, FIFA organized the first official Women's World Cup in China. And the recovery has been monumental.
It really has.
I mean, the 2023 Women's World Cup sold a record 1.5 million tickets and aimed for a global broadcast audience of 2 billion.
And the fact that the women's game survived a half-century exile and thrives today reveals something fundamental about the mechanics of the sport itself. The actual rules, the architecture of the game, they are uniquely captivating.
Let's break down that architecture, because to understand how both the men's and women's games survived and conquered the globe, you really have to look at the elegant simplicity of the 17 laws of the game. I look at the rules of football like an incredibly well-designed, infinitely scalable operating system.
The software and hardware analogy works perfectly here. The laws mandate the specific dimensions of the pitch. So between 100 and 110 meters long for international matches, the circumference of the ball, the number of players, and the nature of fouls.
Exactly how an OS functions. The hardware you run it on can vary wildly.
Right.
You can run those exact same 17 rules on a 600 million euro hypermodern stadium in Madrid with perfectly manicured grass, and you can run those exact same rules on a dirt street in Lagos using rolled-up sweaters for goalposts.
Yeah, the software scales flawlessly regardless of the economic resources of the players.
And those 17 laws, while resilient, have been patched and updated over time, right? To address specific flaws in human behavior.
Oh, absolutely. The introduction of stoppage time is a prime example of a system patch.
The history of stoppage time, where a referee adds extra minutes at the end of the standard 90-minute match, stems from a very specific incident in 1891, doesn't it?
Yes. So Stoke was playing Aston Villa and trailing 1-0. With just 2 minutes left on the clock, Stoke was awarded a penalty kick, which was a massive opportunity to equalize.
Right.
But an Aston Villa player realized a loophole in the rules. He deliberately kicked the ball completely out of the stadium.
Oh, wait.
By the time anyone could retrieve the ball, the final 2 minutes had drained away, the 90 minutes were up, and Stoke was denied their penalty.
That is just hilariously petty, but it was a cynical exploitation of the system.
Completely. So in response, the IFAB updated the laws, mandating that the referee act as the sole official timekeeper with the authority to add time to compensate for deliberate delays.
Yeah.
And they stipulated that a half cannot end until a penalty kick is fully completed.
See, the system constantly refines itself. Even the yellow and red cards we see today to visually communicate warnings and ejections, those weren't even implemented until the 1970 World Cup.
Right, which is pretty recent when you think about it.
And one of the most vital and heavily debated rules in this system is the offside rule.
Yes. The offside rule is essentially a mechanism to prevent goal hanging.
Goal hanging.
Yeah, where an attacking player simply camps out right next to the opponent's goalkeeper waiting for a long pass. The rule dictates that an attacking player cannot be closer to the opponent's goal line than both the ball and the second-to-last defender when the ball is played to them.
Which sounds complicated when you say it out loud, but it fundamentally changes the geometry of the game.
It does. It forces the defending team to move up the pitch as a synchronized unit. It creates this highly strategic, compressed midfield battle rather than just a chaotic long ball contest.
And this highly strategic OS generates an industry that operates on a staggering financial scale. During the 2021-2022 season, the Big Five European leagues, so the top divisions in England, Spain, Germany, Italy, and France, generated a combined 19.6 billion euros in revenue.
But the way these leagues structure their business models dictates the emotional experience of the fan.
Right, because for listeners used to American sports like the NFL or NBA or even the closed system in Australia, leagues operate on a closed franchise system.
Yeah. Exactly.
If your team finishes dead last, there is no structural punishment. In fact, you're usually rewarded with a better draft pick for the following season. So the games at the bottom of the table eventually become totally meaningless.
But in Europe, and across much of the globe, they utilize a system of promotion and relegation. The leagues are interconnected tiers. If you finish in the bottom three of the top league, your team is relegated.
Meaning you are demoted to the lower division for the next season.
Yes, and the top teams from that low division take your place.
And the economic and psychological stakes of relegation are terrifying. I mean, dropping down a division means losing tens of millions of euros in television broadcast rights.
Huge financial hits.
It means the club might be forced to sell its best players to avoid bankruptcy. It severely impacts the local businesses surrounding the stadium.
Which creates an environment of pure existential dread for the fans. A match in late April between the teams in 18th and 19th place is often vastly more tense and more emotionally devastating than a match between the teams fighting for the championship trophy. You are tethered to the financial and social survival of your local institution.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Why should you care if a ball crosses a line? Well, when you scale that profound emotional tethering up from the local club level to the international stage, football ceases to be just an entertainment product and literally becomes a lever for geopolitics.
The jump from club loyalty to national team fervor introduces a concept psychologists call identity fusion.
Identity fusion.
Right. For many individuals, their association with a football team blurs the lines between their personal self and the collective group. This raises an important question about human psychology. We aren't just watching athletes. We are watching a direct proxy for our own nation, our culture, our tribe.
A victory feels like personal validation, and a defeat feels like a personal humiliation. The 2022 Men's World Cup was viewed by 5 billion people. That is more than half the human population experiencing this identity fusion simultaneously. And when that tribal proxy is placed under extreme pressure, it can yield profound real-world consequences. The source material details the infamous football war of June 1969 between El Salvador and Honduras.
And the geopolitical context is vital here. Tensions between the two nations were already at a boiling point due to disputes over immigration, land reform, demographics.
Right, so the football matches didn't invent the hatred.
No, but a highly contentious 3-game World Cup qualifying series acted as the final spark in a powder keg. It was the final proximate cause that led to severed diplomatic relations and a literal armed military conflict that lasted 4 days.
That's horrifying. And we see a similar dynamic in the lead-up to the Croatian War of Independence in the 1990s. An incredibly violent stadium riot erupted in May 1990 during a match between Dinamo Zagreb and Red Star Belgrade. The physical violence on the pitch and in the stands violently exacerbated the existing ethnic tensions that ultimately led to the dissolution of Yugoslavia.
It's stark, but however, the exact same mechanism of identity fusion can be leveraged for diplomacy. Because the rules of the pitch are universally understood, the game can act as a neutral territory when political discourse fails.
Right, look at the Ivory Coast in 2006.
Oh, that's a beautiful example.
The nation was fractured by a brutal civil war. The national team, made up of players from both the rebel-held North and the government-controlled South, qualified for the World Cup. Following the decisive match, the players literally fell to their knees on live television and pleaded with the warring factions to lay down their weapons.
And it worked.
Within a week, the warring parties agreed to a ceasefire. A year later, they played a match in the rebel stronghold of Bouake. bringing government and rebel leaders together peacefully in the same stadium. A football match managed to pause a civil war.
It really proves that this open source language we've been discussing has a vocabulary robust enough to articulate both our deepest animosities and our highest capacities for reconciliation.
It's an incredible journey. We started this deep dive looking at soldiers in Han Dynasty China, elevating a leather fear toward a bamboo hoop.
We watched Victorian men in a London tavern fiercely debate the moral merits of kicking each other in the shins.
Birthing a completely new tactical universe in the process. And we saw female factory workers pulling 53,000 screaming fans, enduring a grueling half-century boardroom ban, and then bouncing back to sell millions of World Cup tickets.
And we tracked how 17 incredibly adaptable rules can generate tens of billions of euros, orchestrate the existential dread of relegation, and act as a psychological proxy capable of inciting riots or securing ceasefires.
It's a system built entirely on human passion, human ingenuity, and historically human flaws. From players deliberately kicking balls out of stadiums to waste time, to referees missing crucial offside calls by mere inches.
But today, the sport is attempting to engineer the flaws out of the system.
Right. With the introduction of video assistant referees, VAR, and automated goal line technology, football is moving toward flawless, machine-officiated perfection.
Computers now map the exact position of a striker's shoulder to determine an offside violation down to the millimeter.
The objective truth is finally available to the referees in real time. But it leaves you with a critical question to consider. We just talked about how human passion, flaws, and arguments built this global identity. If we use technology to systematically remove all the human error, all the missed calls, and all the perceived injustices from the refereeing, will the beautiful game lose the very controversies, the outrage, and the endless pub arguments that caused us to become so deeply tribally obsessed with it in the first place?
It's definitely something to think about.
Keep that in mind the next time you see a referee pause the game, jog over to the sideline, and stare into a video monitor. Catch you on the next deep dive.